What if I told you that the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army wasn't won in the summer sun of France, but in the frozen hell of the Belgian forests during the darkest days of December 1944? The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp, came terrifyingly close to succeeding. For weeks, American soldiers fought outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded in conditions so brutal that men froze to death in their foxholes. Yet somehow, they held. This is the story of how one massive counteroffensive shattered Germany's last hope, and how ordinary Americans became the immovable wall that broke the back of the Wehrmacht forever. December 16th, 1944. While Allied commanders celebrated what they believed would be a quiet Christmas before the final push into Germany, 200,000 German troops were silently moving into position along an 80-mile front in the Ardennes forest. What came next would test American courage like nothing before, and ultimately prove that even Hitler's most audacious plan could not break the spirit of soldiers who refused to yield. The Ardennes Offensive began before dawn on that freezing December morning with a thunderous artillery barrage that shook the earth. German forces, spearheaded by elite SS Panzer divisions, crashed through thinly held American lines. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Ardennes had been considered a quiet sector, a place where green troops could gain experience and exhausted veterans could rest. Intelligence had dismissed the possibility of a major German offensive. After all, Germany was beaten. Everyone knew it. The Red Army was crushing them in the east, and the Allies had liberated France. Victory seemed inevitable, just a matter of time. But Adolf Hitler saw something his generals didn't, or perhaps what they were too rational to imagine. He saw one last roll of the dice. If he could drive a wedge between the American and British forces, recapture Antwerp, and destroy 30 Allied divisions, he might force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. It was fantasy, dressed as strategy, but it was backed by Germany's last reserves of men, fuel, and armor. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise, and for those first terrifying days, it appeared the impossible might actually happen. The battle would rage for 6 weeks across frozen forests and snow-covered hills, claiming 19,000 American lives and wounding tens of thousands more. It would be the costliest battle in American history, exceeding even the carnage of the Civil War's bloodiest days. But here's the intriguing truth that often gets lost in the statistics. Germany lost this battle not because of superior Allied firepower or numbers, but because of something far more fundamental. They lost it because individual American soldiers, often isolated and surrounded, made the conscious choice to stand and fight rather than surrender or retreat. This wasn't a battle won by generals in warm headquarters. It was won in countless small actions by men who had every rational reason to give up, but didn't. To understand why the German offensive ultimately failed, we must first understand the men who stopped it. The American soldiers in the Ardennes that December were not the fresh-faced recruits of Normandy. Many were veterans of the brutal hedgerow fighting in France, men who had learned the savage arithmetic of infantry combat. They had seen friends die, had learned to sleep through artillery fire, and had developed that grim competence that separates survivors from casualties. But interspersed among these veterans were thousands of replacements, young men barely out of training, some of whom had been in Europe for less than a week. The initial German assault fell hardest on two green American divisions, the 106th Infantry Division and the 99th Infantry Division, along with elements of more experienced units stretched thin across the front. Within 48 hours, two entire regiments of the 106th, numbering nearly 9,000 men, were surrounded on a ridge called the Schnee Eifel. They would eventually surrender, the largest mass surrender of American forces in Europe during the war. It seemed to confirm Hitler's belief that American troops lacked the fighting spirit of German soldiers. But what happened next revealed a different truth. At a crossroads town called Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division rushed to the front, found themselves completely encircled by German forces. When the German commander sent a surrender ultimatum, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe replied with a single word: nuts. The siege of Bastogne would become legendary, but it was just one of hundreds of similar stands across the Ardennes. At St. Vith, a hodgepodge of units held a vital road junction for 6 days, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. Along Elsenborn Ridge, the 2nd and 99th Divisions fought a desperate defensive battle that channeled the German advance away from the vital supply dumps that would have fueled their panzers all the way to Antwerp. These weren't strategic masterstrokes planned in advance. They were the instinctive decisions of junior officers and enlisted men who recognized that every hour they held was an hour for the Allies to respond. Lieutenant Lyle Buch and his intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of 18 men held a vital hillside against an entire German battalion for a full day, inflicting over 500 casualties before being overrun and captured. Their stand disrupted the German timetable at a critical moment. Hundreds of similar actions, most never recorded in official histories, created a web of resistance that slowed the German advance to a crawl. The Battle of the Bulge crystallizes three fundamental truths about warfare that challenge our comfortable assumptions about how battles are won. First, it demonstrates that tactical surprise, no matter how complete, cannot overcome operational limitations. The Germans achieved total surprise and initial success, but they had launched an offensive without adequate fuel reserves, counting on capturing American fuel dumps to sustain their advance. When American engineers destroyed these dumps or units defended them to the last man, the vaunted German panzers became nothing more than steel boxes blocking roads. This leads to the second truth. In modern mechanized warfare, logistics matter more than courage. The German plan required them to capture bridges intact, seize fuel supplies, and move faster than the Allies could respond. But a handful of American combat engineers at the Meuse River bridges, a few tank destroyers at a crucial intersection, a single company holding a fuel dump, these small actions cascaded into operational paralysis. The Germans had built their plan on assumptions that required everything to go right. The Americans didn't need everything to go right, they just needed enough things to go wrong for Germany. But the third truth is the most profound and most often overlooked. Individual moral courage in small unit actions determines the outcome of battles more than grand strategy. Military historians love to analyze Patton's rapid repositioning of Third Army or Montgomery's careful preparation for the northern counteroffensive. These were important, certainly, but they mattered because thousands of cold-scared, often isolated American soldiers held their ground long enough for those strategic moves to develop. This wasn't the glory of cavalry charges or dramatic breakthroughs. This was men in frozen foxholes, low on ammunition, and cut off from support, who decided that losing ground was simply not acceptable. Consider the mathematics of resistance. Every hour the Germans were delayed meant tons of Allied supplies reaching the front. Every destroyed bridge meant hours of detours. Every defended roadblock meant German units stacking up, vulnerable to air attack when the weather cleared. The cumulative effect of hundreds of small delays transformed Hitler's timetable, which required reaching the Meuse River in 48 hours, into an impossible dream. By December 20th, just 4 days into the offensive, the German advance had already stalled short of every major objective. The Allied counteroffensive that ultimately destroyed German hopes in the Ardennes didn't begin with a single dramatic moment. It emerged from the convergence of several factors, each building on the foundation of those initial defensive stands. When the weather finally cleared on December 23rd, Allied air power descended on the German columns with devastating effect. Fighter bombers destroyed tanks, trucks, and supply columns backed up on narrow roads. Heavy bombers struck railroad yards and fuel depots deep in Germany, ensuring no reinforcements or supplies could reach the front. But air power alone doesn't win battles. It creates conditions for ground forces to exploit. General George Patton's Third Army executed what many military historians consider the most impressive operational maneuver of the war. In less than 72 hours, Patton disengaged from offensive operations to the south, rotated 3 entire divisions 90 degrees, and drove north through ice and snow to strike the southern flank of the German salient. This wasn't just a matter of moving units on a map. It required coordinating thousands of vehicles on icy roads, repositioning artillery, and ensuring supply lines kept pace with the advance. From the north, British and American forces under Field Marshal Montgomery pressed against the German northern shoulder. The pincer movement that developed wasn't elegant or swift, but it was inexorable. German units that had driven deep into Allied lines now found themselves in increasingly narrow and vulnerable salients. The hunters had become the hunted. German commanders, who had started the offensive believing they could defeat the Americans through superior fighting spirit, now faced the grinding reality that Americans could learn, adapt, and hit back harder than anticipated. The final destruction of the German offensive came not in a single decisive battle, but through relentless pressure that gave the enemy no chance to rest, resupply, or reorganize. American artillery, which had been conserving ammunition during the defensive phase, now fired crushing barrages that pulverized German positions. Tank and infantry teams, working with the coordination born of hard experience, cleared town after town. By January's end, American forces had not only recovered all lost ground, but had pushed beyond their original starting positions. The Battle of the Bulge forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about military leadership, strategic vision, and the nature of sacrifice. The intelligence failure that allowed the Germans to achieve complete surprise was catastrophic. Allied commanders had convinced themselves that Germany lacked the capability for a major offensive, despite warnings from frontline units about suspicious enemy activity. This complacency cost thousands of lives in those first chaotic days. Moreover, the decision to place inexperienced divisions in the Ardennes, assuming it was a quiet sector, reflected a dangerous arrogance about Allied superiority. The soldiers of the 106th Division, some with less than a week in combat, were asked to hold positions against elite SS Panzer divisions. The surprise is not that some units broke. The surprise is that so many held. We must ask, were those thousands of American casualties the necessary price of victory or the result of preventable failures in intelligence and planning? There's also a darker truth about the Battle of the Bulge that challenges the clean narrative of heroic American resistance. During the German advance, SS troops murdered over 80 American prisoners at Malmedy in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. But this atrocity occurred in a broader context of brutality on both sides. American soldiers, enraged by news of the massacre, sometimes took their own revenge. War crimes investigations after the battle revealed difficult truths about what happens when civilized men are thrust into circumstances where survival trumps morality. We must also grapple with the question of whether Hitler's Ardennes Offensive, doomed from the start by logistical impossibilities, actually prolonged the war unnecessarily. The 250,000 German casualties and loss of precious fuel and armor reserves meant Germany had fewer resources to defend against the final Allied offensives. Some historians argue the Ardennes actually shortened the war by accelerating German collapse. Others note that the offensive delayed the Allied advance by 6 weeks and allowed the Soviets to make proportionally greater gains in the east, fundamentally shaping the post-war division of Europe. Compare the American defensive doctrine in the Ardennes to the Soviet approach at similar crisis points. When German forces achieved breakthroughs on the Eastern Front, Soviet commanders often traded space for time, allowing deep penetrations while preparing massive counteroffensives. The Americans, constrained by political concerns about losing liberated territory and psychologically unprepared for retreat, chose to hold ground at enormous cost. Was this the right choice? The answer isn't simple. American commanders were balancing military necessity against the political reality that any significant retreat might have affected home front morale and Allied cohesion. The battle also reveals tensions within the Allied command structure. Eisenhower's decision to temporarily place American forces north of the Bulge under British command enraged American generals, particularly Bradley and Patton. Montgomery's cautious approach and later public statements implying British forces had saved the Americans created friction that nearly fractured Allied unity. The reality was more complex. This was an American battle, fought primarily by American soldiers, but victory required coordination across national lines. The fact that such coordination occurred, despite personal and national rivalries, itself represents a significant achievement. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, during the winter of 1944-45, ordinary men confronted an extraordinary test. They faced not just an enemy offensive, but the fundamental question of what they would do when hope seemed lost and survival meant surrender. The answer they gave in hundreds of foxholes and roadblocks and surrounded towns was that Americans would not break. This wasn't naive optimism or theatrical heroics. It was the grim determination of men who understood that their stand mattered, that every hour they held bought time, that their sacrifice would mean something. Germany lost the Ardennes offensive for many reasons: poor logistics, Allied air superiority, rigid planning that couldn't adapt to changing circumstances. All these factors contributed to the failure. But beneath the strategic analysis lies a simpler truth. They lost because American soldiers refused to be defeated. When surrounded at Bastogne, they held. When cut off at Saint-Vith, they fought. When told to retreat, they often stood their ground instead. This wasn't the result of superior American military culture or training. It was the product of individual choices made by men who found something within themselves they didn't know existed until crisis demanded it. The push that shattered Germany's final defense wasn't a single dramatic breakthrough. It was the cumulative weight of a nation's industrial power, aerial dominance, and adaptable commanders bearing down on an exhausted enemy that had gambled everything and lost. But those factors could only matter because that first crucial week in December, when everything hung in the balance, American soldiers held. They held when it would have been rational to surrender. They held when they were cold, hungry, and isolated. They held because, in the end, they could not imagine living with having failed their comrades. By the time the battle ended in late January, Germany had lost its last mobile reserves, its fuel stocks, and any realistic hope of preventing Allied victory. The road to Berlin lay open. The Third Reich had 6 months left to live, and those months would be a long agony of inevitable defeat. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last roll of the dice, and it came up snake eyes not because of any single American action, but because thousands of Americans, when tested, proved unbreakable. This is what we must remember. Wars are not won by nations or strategies or technologies alone. They are won by men who, when confronted with the abyss, choose to stand rather than yield. The frozen earth of Belgium holds 19,000 American graves, markers of those who made that choice and paid the final price. Their legacy is not just victory in a battle, but proof that ordinary people, when circumstances demand it, can achieve extraordinary things. They were clerks and farmers, mechanics and students, transformed by crisis into the heroes who saved a continent. They deserve to be remembered not as symbols or statistics, but as individuals who faced the worst that war could offer and responded with courage that still echoes through the decades. The Battle of the Bulge reminds us that history's great turning points often come down to the smallest units, the squad, the platoon, the handful of men who must decide in a moment what kind of people they will be. In those frozen forests, Americans decided, and in that decision, they changed the world. What happens when you take a medium bomber designed for high-altitude operations and turn it into a low-level gunship that skims the waves at masthead height? The Japanese Navy found out the hard way in 1943, and the lesson was written in fire across the Pacific. Picture this: a B-25 Mitchell bomber screaming toward you at 200 miles per hour, barely 50 feet above the ocean's surface. You're standing on the deck of a cargo ship, watching this American plane approach, and you think you're safe. After all, bombers drop their payloads from thousands of feet up, don't they? You have time to maneuver, time to evade, but then you see it. The nose of this particular Mitchell isn't transparent like the others, it's solid, and it's sparking with muzzle flashes. By the time you realize what's happening, 850 caliber machine guns are shredding your ship's bridge, and before you can even process that horror, a skip bombing technique sends bombs bouncing across the water like stones, slamming directly into your hull at point-blank range. Welcome to the nightmare that was the Strafer B-25, one of the most devastating tactical innovations of the Pacific War. Today we're diving into the story of how American ingenuity transformed a conventional bomber into a ship-killing monster, and how one man's unconventional thinking changed the way the United States fought the war in the Pacific. This is the story of Major Paul Pappy Gunn, the modified B-25, and the tactics that made the Japanese merchant marine fear daylight. The North American B-25 Mitchell entered service in 1941 as a dependable, versatile medium bomber. Named after General Billy Mitchell, the controversial advocate of air power, it was designed for conventional bombing missions: fly high, drop bombs, return home. It performed admirably in this role, earning fame in April 1942 when 16 B-25s launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet for the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, proving that American bombers could strike the Japanese homeland. But conventional tactics had serious limitations in the Pacific theater. The vast expanses of ocean meant that Japanese supply convoys were the lifeblood of their war effort, and traditional high-altitude bombing proved frustratingly ineffective against moving ships. Bombardiers struggled with the variables: Wind drift, target movement, altitude calculations. Bombs dropped from 20,000 feet frequently missed their targets entirely, splashing harmlessly into the sea while Japanese cargo vessels continued their routes unmolested. By late 1942, Allied commanders faced a critical problem. How do you stop the enemy's logistics when your primary weapon system can't reliably hit the targets? The answer came not from Pentagon strategists or engineering departments back in the States, but from a rough-edged pilot and mechanic working out of improvised airfields in Australia and New Guinea. His name was Paul Irvin Gunn, though everyone called him Pappy, and he was about to revolutionize aerial warfare with little more than determination, mechanical genius, and an absolute refusal to accept that things had to be done the way they'd always been done. Here's the intriguing hook. Pappy Gunn wasn't even officially supposed to be fighting. He was a civilian contractor when Pearl Harbor was attacked, a former Navy pilot running commercial flights in the Philippines. When the Japanese invaded, his wife and children were trapped in Manila. Unable to evacuate them, Gunn watched helplessly as they were captured and interned. That personal stake, that burning need to hit back at the enemy who'd taken his family, fueled an obsession that would change the nature of aerial combat in the Pacific. Paul Gunn's story begins far from the Pacific battlefields. Born in Arkansas in 1899, he grew up in the early days of aviation, when flying was still something between a circus act and a death wish. He joined the Navy in 1917, learned to fly, and fell in love with aircraft the way some men fall in love with the sea, completely, irrevocably, eternally. After leaving the Navy, he bounced around various flying jobs, from barnstorming to commercial aviation, eventually ending up in the Philippines running air transport operations. When war erupted on December 7, 1941, Gunn was in his 40s, too old for combat flying by any reasonable standard. But reasonable had nothing to do with what happened next. As Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Gunn flew evacuation missions, ferrying personnel and supplies under increasingly desperate conditions. His family couldn't get out. That failure, that helpless moment when the woman he loved and the children he'd raised disappeared behind Japanese lines, crystallized something in Gunn. He wasn't going home. He wasn't sitting this war out. He was going to fight, and he was going to make the Japanese pay in blood for every ship, every soldier, every ounce of supplies they tried to move through his ocean. The problem was that the aircraft available to Allied forces in 1942 and early 1943 weren't designed for the kind of war Gunn wanted to fight. Heavy bombers like the B-17 were too valuable and too vulnerable to use at low altitude. Fighters carried limited ordnance. Medium bombers like the B-25 were designed for missions that Gunn knew, from bitter experience, simply weren't working. So he started tinkering. In primitive maintenance facilities across Australia and New Guinea, Gunn began modifying B-25s in ways that would have horrified Boeing engineers. He ripped out the bombardier's position in the nose, all that plexiglass and precision equipment, and replaced it with guns. Lots of guns. He started with 4 50 caliber machine guns, then 6, then 8. He added additional guns in blisters on the fuselage sides. He experimented with mounting 75mm cannons. The resulting aircraft looked like a flying porcupine, bristling with weapons, designed not to drop bombs from a safe altitude, but to fly straight at enemy ships and rake them with overwhelming firepower. But here's where Gunn's genius truly showed. He didn't just modify the aircraft, he modified the entire tactical approach. Working with pilots like Major Edward Larner, Gunn developed skip bombing, a technique where bombs were released at extremely low altitude, around 200 feet, allowing them to skip across the water's surface like flat stones before striking the target's hull at or below the waterline. Combined with the devastating strafing fire from nose-mounted guns, this created a 1-2 punch that Japanese ships simply couldn't withstand. The modified B-25 Strafe represented a fundamental shift in how Americans thought about aerial warfare. Traditional doctrine emphasized altitude, precision, and standoff distance. Stay high, stay safe, use technology to deliver ordnance from beyond the enemy's effective range. This approach worked in European theaters where targets were large, static, and well-mapped. But the Pacific demanded different thinking. Gunn's strafers embodied the concept of close-quarters aerial combat. These weren't surgical strikes, they were brawls. Pilots flew so low that spray from the ocean would coat their windscreens. They approached targets head-on, absorbing defensive fire, while their nose guns systematically destroyed the enemy's ability to fight back. killing gun crews, shredding command bridges, starting fires. By the time the strafer passed over the target vessel, it was already dying. Then came the skip bombs, delivered with brutal accuracy from point-blank range. This challenged every traditional notion of bomber employment. Bombers were supposed to be protected, valuable assets, kept away from light anti-aircraft fire and small arms. Guns' tactics deliberately took them into the teeth of defensive fire. But the psychological and tactical advantages were overwhelming. Japanese gunners, trained to track targets thousands of feet above them, suddenly faced attackers at eye level, closing at terrifying speed. The time available to react, to aim, to fire effectively collapsed from minutes to seconds. Moreover, the strafer B-25s could identify and prioritize targets in real time. High-altitude bombing relied on intelligence that was often hours or days old. A strafer pilot could see the entire convoy, choose the most valuable targets, tankers, ammunition ships, troop transports, and attack them specifically. This wasn't area bombardment. This was assassination. The effectiveness of these tactics was proven again and again throughout 1943 and 1944. In the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943, modified B-25s helped devastate a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce New Guinea, sinking 8 transports and 4 destroyers. Thousands of Japanese troops drowned. The supplies they carried never reached their destination, and the Japanese Navy learned a terrible lesson. Daylight convoy operations in waters dominated by Allied air power had become suicide missions. The strafer B-25 solution emerged from recognizing that the problem wasn't the aircraft's capabilities, it was how those capabilities were being employed. Gunn understood that hitting moving ships required either impossible precision from high altitude or completely different tactics from low altitude. He chose the latter, and in doing so demonstrated principles that remain relevant in military innovation today. First, operational necessity trumps doctrinal purity. The proper way to use a medium bomber was established by training manuals, tactical doctrine, and engineering specifications. But proper wasn't working. Gunn had the freedom, born partly from desperation, partly from operating in a theater where normal supply chains and command structures were strained to breaking, to experiment. He didn't ask permission. He improvised, tested, refined, and proved his concepts in combat before anyone could tell him to stop. Second, combined arms at the tactical level multiplies effectiveness. The strafer concept worked because it integrated multiple weapon systems, machine guns, cannons, skip bombs, and eventually rockets, into a coordinated assault that overwhelmed defenses. No single weapon system was revolutionary, but their integration created something greater than the sum of its parts. Japanese ships could handle strafing runs or could handle bomb attacks, but handling both simultaneously, delivered from point-blank range by an aircraft that absorbed punishment and kept coming, proved impossible. Third, attacking logistics breaks armies. Every Japanese soldier on every Pacific island needed food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. Every aircraft needed parts and gasoline. Every tank needed diesel. All of it came by ship. By making Japanese maritime logistics unsustainable during daylight hours, strafer B-25s and similar modified aircraft forced the enemy into night operations, which reduced efficiency and volume. Supplies that should have reached frontline units never arrived. Reinforcements were decimated en route. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy were slowly starved, not because they lost epic fleet battles, but because modified B-25s destroyed cargo vessels one convoy at a time. The real insight here goes beyond tactics. Innovation often comes from the margins, from people close enough to the problem to understand it viscerally, but far enough from institutional power to think unconventionally. Gunn wasn't a general or a staff officer. He was a mechanic and a pilot who saw what wasn't working and possessed the skill and determination to create something that would work. His solutions weren't elegant or academically rigorous. They were pragmatic, brutal, and devastatingly effective. But we must acknowledge the darker aspects of this story. The strafer B-25 was an instrument of wholesale destruction. When these aircraft attacked Japanese convoys, they killed not only military personnel, but also merchant sailors, many of whom were civilians or conscripted workers. The strafing runs were indiscriminate by nature. Those 50 caliber rounds shredded anyone on deck, whether they were manning a gun or simply trying to survive. The moral calculus of total war suggests these actions were justified, destroying the enemy's ability to wage war, shortening the conflict, saving Allied lives. But the human cost on both sides deserves recognition. There's also the question of how much innovation actually occurred versus how much was rediscovery. Skip bombing wasn't entirely new. British pilots had experimented with similar techniques. Low-level strafing attacks had been used in other theaters. What Gunn did was refine and systematize these approaches, turning occasional tactics into standard operating procedure. This doesn't diminish his achievement, but it reminds us that innovation rarely emerges from nothing. It builds on existing knowledge, combines disparate elements, and applies them in new contexts. Furthermore, we might question whether the strafer concept represented genuine innovation or simply necessary adaptation to circumstances. In the European theater, where Allied air forces eventually achieved near-total air superiority and faced different target sets, high-altitude precision bombing remained the dominant approach. The strafer B-25 wasn't a universal solution. It was a contextual one, perfectly adapted to Pacific conditions, but less relevant elsewhere. This raises important questions about military innovation. Are we creating genuinely better ways to fight, or are we simply finding the least bad options for terrible situations? Comparing Gunn to other innovators highlights both his uniqueness and his place in a larger tradition. Like Marine Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson, who adapted guerrilla tactics for his raider battalions, or Colonel Charles Lindbergh, who taught Corsair pilots to extend their range through fuel management, Gunn recognized that doctrine written in peacetime often fails in combat's crucible. These men shared a willingness to question authority, trust their own judgment, and persist despite resistance from conventional military hierarchies. Yet there's something distinctly American about Gunn's story. The mechanic-turned-warrior, the pragmatic tinkerer, the man who valued results over regulations. This archetype appears throughout American military history, from frontier rangers who abandoned European linear tactics to modern special operations forces who emphasize flexibility over rigid doctrine. It reflects a cultural tendency to trust individual initiative and practical results over institutional authority and theoretical perfection. The B-25 Strafe didn't win the Pacific War by itself. No single weapon system ever does, but it fundamentally altered the strategic calculus in that theater, making Japanese maritime logistics unsustainable and accelerating the island-hopping campaign that brought American forces ever closer to the Japanese homeland. By late 1944, Japanese commanders had learned to fear daylight convoy runs through waters where modified B-25s operated. Supplies moved at night, slowly, inefficiently, always at risk. The logistics network that sustained Japan's far-flung empire gradually collapsed, not from one catastrophic blow, but from 1,000 cuts delivered by aircraft that shouldn't have been able to do what they did. Paul "Pappy" Gunn survived the war. His family, imprisoned in Manila, was liberated in 1945. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross and numerous other decorations, though he remained characteristically gruff about his achievements. He continued working with aircraft after the war, eventually dying in 1957, long before most people knew his name or understood what he'd accomplished. But his legacy lives in every moment, when military forces face the gap between doctrine and reality, when someone looks at an established system and asks, what if we did it differently? The Strafer B-25 teaches us that innovation doesn't require billion-dollar research programs or advanced technology. Sometimes, it requires nothing more than clear-eyed assessment of what's failing, mechanical skill, courage to challenge conventional wisdom, and the determination to keep refining until you create something that works. The Japanese Navy learned this lesson in the most visceral way possible. Watching their convoys torn apart by bombers that flew so low, their pilots could see the terror on enemy sailors' faces that delivered bombs with the precision of a point-blank pistol shot that turned supply runs into death sentences. They laughed when they first saw those modified B-25s with their solid noses and extra guns, thinking Americans had created something clumsy and desperate. They stopped laughing when their ships began sinking in flames. War is ultimately about will and resources, the will to continue fighting and the resources to sustain that fight. Every innovation, every tactical adaptation, every mechanical modification serves one of those two purposes: strengthening your side's will and resources or destroying the enemy's. The Strafer B-25 did both. It gave Allied air crews an effective weapon against a previously elusive target, boosting morale and confidence. And it systematically destroyed Japan's ability to sustain its scattered forces. resource by resource, ship by ship, convoy by convoy. So the next time you see a B-25 Mitchell in a museum, with its graceful lines and transparent nose, remember that some of these aircraft fought a different war. They flew low where others flew high, they brawled where others bombed, and they proved that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to one person refusing to accept that things must be done the way they've always been done. Pappy Gunn looked at a medium bomber and saw a gunship. He looked at high-altitude doctrine and saw low-level devastation. He looked at an enemy who thought they were safe and showed them with brutal clarity that safety was an illusion when American innovation went to war. That lesson, written in fire across the Pacific, remains relevant today. Never mistake established practice for inevitable truth. Never assume your enemy has solved their problems correctly, and never underestimate what determined people can accomplish when they're willing to challenge everything they've been told about how things are supposed to work. The Japanese convoy commanders who watched modified B-25s approach, who saw those nose guns sparking, who realized too late what was about to happen, they understood in their final moments that they'd underestimated American ingenuity. They'd assumed the war would be fought according to rules, according to doctrine, according to the way things had always been done. Pappy Gunn taught them otherwise, one sinking ship at a time.